I think the commentary makes it a little bit more exciting for sure, but again, not essential for getting the main idea of the video here. So really what I would do at this point is really try not to say anything about the video at all. I don't want to make any comments about it. I don't want to say, did you notice this thing? I'm keeping it at this point just really open-ended and giving students the opportunity to formulate their own questions. So what we would do next is we would then go over this QFT process. And I know it seems like it's unnecessary to explicitly teach questioning techniques, but I do need a little bit of that, I think, direct instruction at the beginning. So we use this same exact form for each of our units. So they see this every single time we start a new storyline. We ask them to make some observations first. So any sort of comments or things that they notice or things that they just observe in the video will go in this top section where it says, I notice. And the main point of what we're going to be doing next is then coming up with the actual questions. So down below, there's a section that says, I wonder. There's questions certainly don't have to start with I wonder, but it's just an idea to give them, this is where you're supposed to be writing your questions at. There's space for 5 of them here. It seems like it's a reasonable expectation to ask them to come up with 5, but some kids, usually on this first round, really have a hard time coming up with more than 1 or 2. Other kids could fill out questions all day long, so it just depends on the student's kind of mindset that they're in. You always have that one person that's constantly asking questions. Some kids are really great at it. Others will require a little bit of practice. So I asked them to include on this first one, usually at least 3. And then when we're done with that, just writing down their questions, I give them as much time as seems necessary until everyone has the questions that I'm asking them to come up with. If it takes a little bit longer, then we wait until that student has the opportunity to be able to come up with more. After they come up with their questions, then the only other real things that we want to focus on are they closed or are they open questions? So if it is a closed question, we do ask them to try to revise it, something more open-ended, instead of saying like, something about the lion just as more of an observational thing, maybe asking how or why a lion is doing something in particular, makes the question a little bit more open-ended and gives us something to work with in terms of coming up with lessons to go off of that. After they've come up with all their questions, then we ask them to prioritize them, usually just asking them what questions do you think are the most important or which ones are most interesting to you, which ones are the ones that you really want to get answered, and we prioritize them so we can kind of focus our next couple lessons on the things that are most important to the students. The idea here is that students essentially are driving what the next activities are. As a teacher with these storylines laid out, we kind of already have an idea of where we're going next, but it gives them some buy-in. And I certainly you can adjust things as you go. If there is something that's not quite touched on in the storyline materials, you could take a little, detour and answer some other student questions. But typically there's going to be at least a couple students that are kind of touching on some of the main ideas that we're trying to get them to, come up with from those videos. So we would have students fill this out. Go ahead, Alice.
I was going to say, this is one of those things, like if we tie it back to the beginning, like we wouldn't necessarily take this for a grade. You can either do it digital or paper. So
for sure. But the most important part then is coming up with some sort of like question board. So it could be on paper with Post-it notes. I've used Padlet, Alex primarily used Jamboard last year, something to get their main questions onto a communal space where other students can see that. I try to leave that until the very end. I don't want students to see other students' questions because then they end up just copying down the same ones that their neighbor wrote down. So making them individually do those questions first, potentially talking about it in a small group if they think that if it seems like they're going to be a little bit hesitant to share out questions, maybe starting with a smaller group of 3 or 4 students to be able to share with each other and then picking a spokesperson for the group. But we want a way to be able to get all those questions out together. So we've got 2 examples here just of some of the completed ones that we've done before. We can see these okay. So these are just some of the questions that one of my class periods in the past had come up with. Keep in mind, this is the first time we're doing it, so I think the quality of questions gets better and better throughout the year. So typically what I would do with this then, and we probably put it in a different area on this one, but kind of grouping some of those main themes together. So, these ones are kind of asking about, prey or energy or food related things. Others just want to know like what's going on with that crocodile, where did he come from? Others are asking about groups because they notice that both the lions and the wildebeest or water buffalo are in groups as well. So just trying to figure out some of those main themes that students have come up with And then you can kind of drag and drop and group those into some of those main categories, which Alice, I think, does a better job with on her Jamboard.
So this is an example of a Jamboard. We haven't answered these questions yet. I tried to pull off all the answers so that way you could kind of see like what it looked like before the kids got to it. Jamboard, one of the things I don't like about Jamboard is you can't see who's contributing what. I like Laurel, I try and keep it so that way the kids can't go ahead and start editing and putting questions up until everyone's ready. And so if you haven't used Jamboard before, you can just go ahead and add sticky notes, or they could add pictures. I try and avoid that. But sticky notes, and they will go ahead and choose a color. But once everyone's gone ahead and thrown up a question to it, we go through and kind of sort them based off of grouping. And I have different classes. Obviously, this class was much smaller, and this one was not as much as well. Also, what could have happened too is kids will go ahead and post a lot of the same questions once they see a friend or it's worded differently, things like that. You can go through and actually edit the post-it notes. So be different colors. You can also go ahead and delete them too. So it kind of helped us sort and go through. You can see my first hour had a much wider variety of questions versus my fourth hour versus my sixth hour. What I also liked about this too is as we went through and answered them throughout the unit or throughout the storyline, my kids could go ahead and see, hey, what did first hour ask? What did fourth hour ask? What did sixth hour ask? And so if they were asked in different hours, I just left them on that hour. But as you can see, my first hour asked a lot more questions. So these are probably some of the questions that my sixth hour didn't think of. And so it's kind of a nice way to go back through and see. You can see at the beginning, some of them used I wonder, because they used the sentence starters from the QFT form. And which is fine, it's totally okay. But towards the end of the year, they started, I don't think I ever saw an I wonder. It was just more blatant questions. And I think when we did canines or penguins, I didn't even give them the QFT form. It was one of the ones towards the end because they were on it and they knew how to do it. And I just gave them the Jamboard instead of doing the QFT. So different options for different things.
I do try to stress here that we're looking for somewhat scientific questions. They don't have to include vocabulary or super intense scientific concepts, but some of the questions you could see on my Padlet are like, who's recording the video? Or like, why is that person wearing those shoes? Like, they're things that aren't going to be able to drive our instruction at all. So I try to not direct their questioning too much, but try to get them to focus on things that we can answer in a scientific way or with some research or our kind of big picture ideas rather than focusing on one particular detail that isn't going to be a scientific topic. It can be a little difficult for some of them. So that would be the very, very first activity. We're going to do that week 1. We'll do that a couple days into school. You could certainly start day 1 with that, even if you just want to get students hooked a little bit. We'd go through that QFT, we'd get all of our questions down, and then essentially those questions are going to be what we're working on answering for the rest of the storyline now. So there are a couple activities that we're going to skip over right now. We're not going to do the very first activity. We wanted to show you one that's a little bit more in depth. But based on that, the next couple activities are usually related to adaptations and observations. There were 3 main organisms in that video that students are able to observe. The water buffalo, the lion, and then there was a crocodile if you were paying close attention. It's more obvious in the video with the commentary because everyone's freaking out when the crocodile shows up. So we take a look at some of the adaptations, just practicing making observations, some differences between those 3 groups of organisms. And then our first main activity with the students is called Life as a Hunter. They're calculating some different energy needs, and it really answers that question of why do lions hunt in groups, which is one of the questions we kind of hope some of the students are going to touch on in that first QFT round. This is the first time they'll actually see a CER as well, so it's really early on in that first week. Students might already be exposed to the CER format, so that QFT and CER will be using repeatedly over the rest of the year. They're pretty familiar with it after week 1 only. So We're going to skip ahead to our Lulu activity. This is the one that we're going to go through in a little bit more detail with you to show you an example of one of the ones where students are doing a lot of like building and inquiry from data sets, and eventually they'll have some sort of CER at the end where they're going to have to make a claim based on all the evidence that they've collected over a series of events. And this one will take several days of class time. This isn't just like a one-day activity. So the original document is here listed for you in the presentation. Alice is going to go through the paper version with you. We did do some of this on paper, but anytime we had some activity where there was a series of data sets, we prefer to print those out for students. It's an easier way for them to have all of the data set and writing in front of them, rather than having to like pull up 5 different Google Docs or something like that. Throughout the presentation, you will see Google Docs linked there, so you're welcome to open them as just examples of what that might look like. Not a couple, yeah, into some of those like data sets there. So there's a document that students could have filled out digitally. That's probably coming from the Rockwood district, who was virtual last year. But this is an activity that I prefer to do more on paper. So that's what Alice is going to show you today.
I'm going to go ahead and switch off of this because we have a doc cam, and so I can't show the screen at the same time. So if Laurel or Jessica, while I get the screen set up, if everyone has the presentation open on their screen or on a dual screen, or be able to split it, that's probably going to be the best so you can follow along. But while I switch over, can one of you go ahead and start talking about this slide and go from there? And then I'll jump in when we get to data sets.
I'm going to go ahead. Oh, I just sent that to Alice. I'm going to send this to everyone as well. Again, if you need the link for the presentation, if you need to open that up on your own screen, you're welcome to. So those driving questions that the students then came up with in the QFT, we're going to try to start answering some of those. So our driving question here is, how do we determine parentage? So a lot of the students mentioned like there's a baby involved with that water buffalo, and looking at our lion groups and how complicated group structure can be sometimes. So we're kind of playing off of that group structure that we examined in the last activity. We calculate the energy needs, and we realize that it's more efficient for lions to hunt in groups. And so now we're just going to explore that group situation a little bit more detailed. So we're going to take a look at who is the mother, who is the father, and how can we figure that information out. When you do have organisms that live in groups, how are you able to identify the smaller like family settings within there? Do we have individual family situations within the larger group, or is it a little bit more complicated, and we'll be able to figure that out using these data sets that are provided for us. I can see that, Alice, so looks like it's working. That is backwards. I don't know if you're able to flip. There we go. So this is the first data set that students will see. So on the slides, there is a little bit of background information, but this is looking at data set 1. So this is the first piece of information that the students will actually receive. There are 5.
Sorry, can you see that? It looks regular in mine.
It's backwards.
Yeah.
It's backwards for you guys. So it'll be backwards.
Because Laurel is also talking, you might want to pin Alice so that way you can see her screen larger. So it's probably hard to see.
But it looks good for you guys. It's just backwards for me. Okay, cool.
It's yes, that's right now.
We'll go with it. It'll be fine.
All right, so a lot of these data sets essentially build on top of themselves. So this first one's going to be pretty introductory. There's some information in there that students can pull out, but we'll just keep adding more and more details as students start to realize what kind of information they really need. So you can read this on the slides, or you can read it on Alice's screen there as well, but it's just a bunch of qualitative observations. There are some dates and some numbers identifying some of the lions. But in general, it's talking about where are they, how many are there, what kind of observations are they able to make. One of them is limping. This lion seems to be missing again. So it's just making some general observations, just kind of like lab journal notes that some scientists have actually taken. And this is all actual real data from 1992. So I think it's interesting that it's not just made up information, it is actual scientific recordings that some researchers have included for us. So students now are going to be looking at this data and answering some questions that go along with it to try to get them to see if we can figure out at this point which organisms, which of those lions might be part of smaller family groups. Is it obvious from this information? Are we missing information? So really just like interpreting the data that's provided to them.
One of the things that we like doing with having this data set on paper is a lot of kids will go ahead and highlight or underline things like that. The PowerPoint obviously does have each one of these sections there for you. One of the things that the kids tend to point out, they're like, where are these locations? Like, that's one of the big underlying questions is where are these? Like, I don't know where that is. It's also a little bit of a geography lesson for them. My students also having the CT classes like to go ahead and highlight the males in a different color versus underlining or highlighting the females in a different. It was just a nice way for them to visually understand where they are. Some of my kids, some of my really high flyers would go ahead and like make a note being like down here at the bottom, they'll say like, oh, we never see this one again, things like that. So they'll kind of use this as a nice reference sheet moving forward. This is definitely something that my kids put in like a tiny folder that they usually have for the class or a 3-ring binder of some sorts. You're more, like I said, you're more higher executive functioning kids probably have things like within dividers and all that. But for most kids, they just can go ahead and throw this in a folder. It will come back. So I tell them they have to hold on to it.
And keep in mind here, at this point, students know what question we're trying to answer. So that how do we determine parentage? They're trying to figure out in this situation, can you tell who the parents are of individual cubs? So that is their whole goal here. They're going to kind of highlight any information that they might think is relevant to that. And it might ask them then after they've done some observing, can you tell me who the cubs' parents are based on the information given to you so far? And so they'll come up with some evidence specifically from that document. They need to like list out specific pieces of evidence that they pulled out as important to be able to make that claim. At this point, the information is pretty limited. They shouldn't really be able to figure out exactly who the parents are at this point. So then the next idea here is, what else do we need to know? What other information do you need to be able to answer that question? And the idea here is to get them to come up with what might be useful. Rather than just giving them the next data set, can they come up with some information that would be helpful to be able to answer that question?
As you go through too, certain like vocab words will come up. My kids will, again, the accelerator in general will probably be fine. CTU has like a hard time with nomadic. And so one of the other strategies that you could do is read this aloud and actually make like a vocab list going onto the whiteboard. Any vocab list that I would actually go ahead and put on the Quizlet that we would build on every day. I tell the kids nomadic is not a word that we're really functioning or like worried about. We'd be more worried about like, what does like genetic analysis mean? Or, you know, pedigree would be another vocab word that we would be concerned on. We wouldn't really focus on what it means to be nomadic. So if that helps.
And then just in general, having them be able to make broad observations, like in general, what kind of pattern do you see happening here? So are they all staying in one spot? Are they moving together as a whole group? So they're able to make other observations that aren't necessarily only directly related to parentage, but just practicing some of those other cross-cutting concepts or skills can happen here as well. So it's a pretty easy introduction. The information isn't necessarily complicated, so they just need to take some time to be able to start making some of those observations on their own or in small groups. And I don't think I go into too much detail with this as a whole class. I think it is one of those activities that's nice to have it kind of student driven at their own pace. But if they're really struggling as a group to be able to come up with some of those main observations, it might be something that would need to be a little bit more modeled. I'm sure Alice does more with her classes.
Okay. We good for moving on to data set 2?
Yeah, I think so. So it does mention specifically in there that genetic data was
collected.
So I was gonna say, I thought that I remember, again, I'm sort of staying quiet just because it's been obviously a year or over a year since I've done this myself. I remember the advanced saying, like maybe they would have their students ask, like figure out what they need to ask for. Like you're not just giving them the data. They, so they wouldn't have all the data sets in front of them. You would have them, you know, at your desk, and they would figure out data set one, and they would come up to you and they're like, we have this data, but I think blank would be helpful. And you can kind of guide them to saying, I think we need, you know, where they live. And then you're like, oh, well, here you go. And then eventually the next one is going to be, you know, where there are their alleles that you eventually look at. Like, well, I think we need some information about their DNA, so we can see who's related. And then you're like, oh, here you go. So I think I remember when we gave this out, I don't know how you did it last year, like we just gave them the whole packet. And so they like kind of knew ahead of time. So I don't know, like that is.
You're right, yeah.
Adjusted as well.
I forgot to mention that. We did give them one piece at a time. So they are labeled data set 1, data set 2. I mean, you could give it to them as a huge package, but we definitely did page by page. Thank you. Forgot about that.
So I think, yeah, page by page is better, but on how you want to get your students, like, do you want them to say, hey, this is the data I need? Or are you just going to say, oh, you finished one. Okay, here's the next one. Like, so that is one way you could modify it too.
So one of the main conclusions that they should be getting from this is that the lines do tend to move around quite a bit. And it is a little bit complicated to try to follow a particular group of those organisms. So data set 2 then is going to take a look at more geographical data, basically putting all of the field notes into a table and then into a map. So the students are going to actually map out the location of some of these different individual lions. It also lists whether they're male or female, their general ages, and whether they're alive or missing, or what kind of status they have. So this is going to give them a little bit more organized information in the form of a table and a map. So on Alice's screen, you can see at the bottom there, they have all the data that they need, and they're just going to make a little map with a key to highlight where each of those lions ended up in a particular time frame. So
this is one of the activities that we did do digital. We didn't do this one on paper. You could easily do it on paper if you wanted to. It was just easy for the kids to go ahead and insert using your Google drawing to go ahead and insert a symbol into here. The actual key is on your PowerPoint slide, not on here, but so 628, you could do it like using a purple star. And so you'd have to go ahead and find out where 628 was first mentioned. 628 was mentioned first here. And so you'd have to go ahead, find it. Okay, we'll put a star.
It's on the table at the top then. It's summarized for them in the table at the above. So they can use both of those data sets to have a little extra information.
So it originated here and it's still residing. So we're just going to leave it there. The kids can go ahead and follow it along in the story format as well. Let me find one that's different. So we'll look at 631. 631, I'll do as like a blue circle. So you could also have them put it up here so that way they can follow along. It starts originally here and ends here. So we would just have them go ahead and draw a line. Like I said, you could have them do it on paper. We had them do it digitally, I believe, because it was still the beginning of the school year. And so we were a little, concerned about contact tracing and things like that in terms of sanitizing all the different colored pencils. But so by the end, if you look on, I think it's slide 19, it has your whole answer key. There are, 657. You don't know where they end up going, along with 668. That's just unknown, or I'm sorry, the African Reserve. So they moved out. So it's a little hard to see. And so we just have the kids put like a question mark or make a key or symbol. But like I said, nice little geography lesson in terms of mapping, which they kind of appreciate. And as a forewarning, as you go through the African storyline, you end up becoming really familiar with all of the parts of Africa, which is really great. I like that it has that part to it.
So after students then are going to map their information, they're going to then, of course, kind of come back and make some observations and see if a claim can be made yet at this point about who the parents are of each of the cubs. And so at this point, I think we're asking them to make a prediction after the first round. And so a lot of times it says like, how's your claim changed based on the new evidence that you have in front of you, or it's presented in a slightly different way. Does your claim still have evidence to support it? Are there any changes that you'd like to make to your claim? And ask them, do you need more information? Like what else would be helpful at this point? And I think, Alice, at this point is when they do some research. Is that the next
We
part?
do. I'm trying to pull it out of my binder.
So instead of giving them a brand new data set at this point, the roles of the lions in the group are kind of explored in a little bit more detail here. So students just kind of take a little break from the data sets and do a little bit of research about who does the hunting, what is the role of the male versus the female, what kind of information can we get from scientific websites and things like that. So scientific name, roles of each of the different males and females and cubs, who's responsible for each thing in the pride, and it gives them a little bit more background information that might be useful to be able to use those data sets properly.
It's also a really great way to go ahead and start doing a little bit of like table partner work, things like that. We do spend a little bit of time on like what is valid information, what would be invalid, so credible and non-credible, which is a nice little introductory since they will be doing a lot of research throughout the curriculum. So we just kind of emphasize Wikipedia is bad. It's a great part to start brainstorming ideas, but like what are actual credible sources?
So at this point, they still are a little bit unsure, but parentage at this point is not really a clear answer. After they've done some research, they start to realize that some of the organisms can move around quite a bit. Typically, there's going to be one primary male in the pride, and that male can change pretty frequently. A lot of the females tend to be related to each other, so the genetic component of it gets a little bit complicated. And so the next few data sets are going to be primarily focused around the genetic information to see if we can narrow down parentage a little bit more than what we've been able to do so far. So on data set 3 then is going to be a karyotype. Students have essentially zero information about genetics at this point. They don't really have the background knowledge to be able to interpret genetic information. So this was something we struggled with, and I think I still struggle with, is not giving them too much information. It says that this is a karyotype. It's a picture of chromosomes. That's a lot of vocab words in just this tiny little paragraph. So I typically give them, you know, enough information to allow them to understand what they're looking at, but I try not to like go into a lecture here about chromosomes and karyotypes and what that really means. So they're going to look at this and they're going to try to make some observations.
I was going to say, one of the things that we talk about and we're like, okay, so what sort of patterns do you notice here? And so we really start getting, okay, patterns here, and we start making inferences. We're like, okay, so why would you have 2 of A1? And what does that mean in terms about parents? And it really allows the kids to reflect on their current knowledge of what they have stored back there. And so eventually you will get and be like, oh, well, one's mom, one's dad. Okay, so why do you think they're paired up? So it's a lot of questioning. We're not, like Laurel said, not doing a lot of lecturing. This is where my whiteboard gets really full of vocab words. So, but I don't really go into what is a gene, what are alleles, things like that. I'll pull out like karyotype and chromosome, and that's about it. And so it starts getting into a good conversation about why it's organized in this way, and really about looking at patterns and analyzing those patterns.
And there are those guiding questions in the document. So if you're feeling a little lost in like how much you should be kind of guiding students, I think the packet does a great job already of kind of asking them some of the main things it wants them to pull out without you needing to give them too much information. So
yeah, so what observations do you make when viewing the karyotype? Why are chromosomes paired? Again, we haven't given them a lecture at all. This is truly just their inferences based off of conversations we're having in the classroom.
So conclusions at this point, someone who has a good background of, you know, genetic information, it seems like it might be helpful to have some chromosome pictures, some pictures of your DNA in front of you, but not knowing the specific genes that are located on those chromosomes, we can kind of come to the conclusion that I still can't make a decision on, who the mom of 627 is or whatever the numbers are of those cubs. So although it is genetic information, we still don't have everything we need to be able to narrow down specifically who the mom and the dad is of each of the cubs in the pride. So again, last question on this worksheet, what other information would be helpful to you? And students then should come to the conclusion that they need specific information, what is getting passed on from each of the parents. And this is their first introduction to alleles. And there's a couple vocab words here, allele, genotype. There are going to be some things that students have not seen before. You can see the names of the genes up there, the different loci that the genes are located at. So looks like a lot of information, but students pick up on the pattern really, really quickly, even without having a detailed genetic lecture. I'm always surprised at how well students are able to understand this concept as a whole without being kind of bogged down by some of those vocabulary words. So it does list out all of the alleles that are possible for each of the different genes, and then it gives you specifically the 2 alleles that the females and the cubs have. This is going to be just the moms. The dads are not located on this document yet. We will get that next, but we're going to narrow down and see if we can figure out who the mom is of the cubs in the pride. And so with the quick discussion as a group, I think pretty quickly students are able to realize that the female has to pass on one of their alleles to the cub, so they can start narrowing down, who the potential moms are of each of the cubs below.
I was going to say, one of the things that we'll talk about is, again, looking at patterns. We're like, okay, there's 2 listed here. Why would we have 2 listed? Do you get both of those? And so data set 4, they would go ahead and analyze those questions, which leads us to data set 5.
And you can go to that last page, Alice, if you want to fill in just one example of the mom. So
yeah,
this is what the students will get. They can fill out the possible mothers for each of the cubs. We don't have dad's alleles at that point when we're looking at data set 4, so they aren't able to complete the side for dad all the way on the right, but we can identify mom first, or at least narrow it down a little bit, and they're able to fill that out. You don't do a full example, but you can see
fill this out. So this is a great example where I would go ahead and model just for our CT kids. I would probably do 709 together all as a class, go ahead and project it. So you have here that you have cubs 709, and then we talk about how these are the different specific genes that we're looking at that were pulled during the blood types. And so we'll look at possible mother, and possible mom has A or B. This cub has A and C, so that means they probably got A from mom, which means they would need to go ahead and get C from dad. So you put it over here, C. And so here, M and M from 6, and you would do that for all of them. So 630, B and B, they wouldn't get anything from here. And 687, C and C. So they would get C and C from here. You would do the, sorry, I have the answer key, so I'm trying not to skip ahead. 709, we would do the same logic. So I'm sorry, for 628 has M and N. So they would give them the M here. 630 has M and N as well. So they would only be able to give M. 687 has M and N as well. They're all similar. So M and would go here, which means they would have to go ahead and give one M from here. So we have A or C.
Students pick up on this pattern really, really quickly.
Yeah.
I think, and so you can cross off mom 630 since she doesn't have that one particular allele to be able to pass on. Students will narrow down more and more, and they will come to the conclusion that there are several moms that all are mothering the cubs in this pride. So it's not as simple as just one mom and one dad. That's the same parents for all the cubs. Once they find out all of the mom information, then again, we're going to ask them to make those final observations. What other information do you need? And that's when they then get data set number 5, which includes the females, the cubs, as well as the dads. And then they can narrow it down a little bit further. And if I remember correctly, they are able to figure out the specific mom and dad for each of the cubs. It's not like
yes,
are unknown. They're actually able to.
Let me pull it out.
The parent of each one.
Yeah, so eventually, this is what the answer key does look like when you go ahead and fill it all out. You can see cub 710 is really probably one of the easier ones to figure out if I remember right. Or no, 7, 710, 711 are hard. 712 is probably the easiest one to fill out. And so everyone does this a little differently based off of your class. And this, like Laurel was saying at the beginning, is not the first activity. So you get, by now, you're a couple of weeks into school and have a pretty good idea of what kids are going to be struggling and what kids are not. If you do have a group of kids that takes a little bit longer to do it, my suggestion to you would be, okay, we did 709 together. So everyone then can go ahead and work on 710. And then you could go around and spot check them to make sure they did 710 correctly before moving on that way. So probably for like the accelerated classes, they're probably going to get at this right away and it won't take them very long. I could see them doing that really easily. I know for our CT class, it was probably like a full A-day block for them to be able to do this. So for pacing wise.
So after they fill out both the moms and the dads, then we're going to kind of come back and make some conclusions. Compare it to their initial claim. Does your claim still have enough evidence to support that, or has your claim changed? It shows students that, you know, claims can change throughout a process. If it's not going to be supported by evidence, it doesn't have to be like, I made this claim and I have to stick with that the entire time. As evidence becomes available, you can certainly change your claim as long as you have the evidence to support it. And our question comes down to, was Lulu the mother of all the cubs? Was she the mother of any of them? Lulu is this one main line that they're following. At the beginning, most students say that Lulu is the mom of all of them based on the minimal information that's given to them. And at the end, they find out that she is not the primary mom in the group. So,
yeah. So this is a sample of a CER, of a correct CER. So you have the claim that's given to them, and then they're given the evidence and they're given the reasoning. Everything else is filled in. Sorry, I didn't print it in color. So they find out that Lulu is the mother of cub 711, since they shared a common allele for all the genes listed below. However, she was not the mother of the other cubs. If they didn't include that last statement, I think we gave them a 4 out of 5 on the rubric. To get a full 5, they did have to state that she was related to the other cubs. And so you can go through and list the different genes on the different loci. And then this is a really short reasoning. I did not expand on this. And so you can go ahead and expand on it. There are other follow-up questions in terms of advantages and disadvantages, why they thought they migrated them in certain ways. And that's it. We put this CER in as a quiz, I believe. I did have listed as quiz 1. So it's not, this is the first time they're actually having a formal assessment. Everything else up until this point was most likely classwork or participation checkoff. Everything.
And keep in mind that this is not the first CER they're doing. I don't think it's fair to put in a CER as a first round quiz, but because they've already experienced the CER format in the past, you know, it's more reasonable to start counting these for quizzes because they will be using them many times throughout the year. But that first one is a little bit rough, and I would still be a little lenient with my grading on this one. Students aren't really probably that confident in this formatting yet, but it is like, you know, almost like a week's worth of activities, you know, so at least several days worth. So these conclusions that they're coming up with in a CER really shows you, do they understand all the different pieces of evidence? Are they able to support their, you know, claim with pieces of evidence that are specific? If you notice in Alice's evidence section, she's got specific different genes that are listed there, rather than just saying, you know, Lulu shared some similar genes without listing out the specific ones. Students aren't going to get full credit for that. So this is a good one to show them how quantitative or specific numbers and values are going to be much more important when they're given to you. Sometimes that's not provided, but when you have that information, listing out specific genes and alleles is going to be important to really prove or really support your claim that you're trying to make.
And I believe at some point, it might have been on the actual assessment that we put for Lions, we put it on as a bonus point. Because they were allowed to use their data sets, they weren't allowed to use anything. And so at some point we gave them a bonus set if they could say how Lulu was related to the other lions and why they thought that. I can't remember where we put it. I'm trying to look through it.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but it is important what you just said, that they have access to all of their data sets. Like, there's no reason that they have to fill out this CER from memory. They have all of the data in front of them. It's available to them at all times. If this is an assessment especially, then we just make sure that we have them collect all their data sets, probably staple them together. We're not trying to test their knowledge on memorizing who was the mom of each of those lions, but really, can they use the evidence to support and make that claim? So again, it's a little bit different than your traditional, like, memorization. At this point, we're really focusing on their skills. And they're using a little bit of genetic background information, and that should be kind of explained more in their reasoning section. But really, we're focusing on their skills of using evidence, making a claim, and being able to like come up with a solid reasoning to explain why that's something that they're claiming. So I would say it's still pretty rough at this point in the year. I do think that they have a hard time expecting or knowing what's expected of them. So I think modeling some after this process to show them, this one was maybe lacking some specific details in the evidence, or this one had a really great reasoning. I think it's nice for them to see some other examples and kind of come back, excuse me, and be able to like show students some high quality work or ones that maybe could be improved on.
Yeah, the one that's done before this is Life as a Hunter, where it tied into that KCAL activity that we showed you with dragging of all the money, because they do have to go ahead and I'm trying to find it. They have to go ahead and explain why certain prey are more advantageous to hunt. And so they do write, that's their first CER that they have to go ahead and write. And they are not the best, they are not great. But we did a lot of rewriting on terms of, okay, what does this look like? How do we make it, how do we add more to it and things like that? So we did do a little bit of a rewrite. I don't know how everyone works with their building site, but in English, they do something also very similar to a CER. It's a CEW, claims evidence warrant. So as the year goes on, their CERs do get stronger because of that same very similar strategy that they use in English. So they're not only seeing that writing strategy here in biology, but they're also seeing it in their English classes as well. We've got a lot of time left over because ideally, we would have been doing this in person and we would have been handing you out data sets and having you guys work through it. Obviously, we can't do that with you. It was my first year doing storylines last year, and I'm going to be honest, it was week 3 of school, and we're already doing genetics, and I was very, very apprehensive. I mean, I've been teaching for a decade, and I was like, what do you mean we're doing genetics within the first month of school without teaching them anything about it? And true testament, I was amazed at what these kids could do. And I took a leap of faith that from Jessica and Laurel, and they're like, no, it's great, you can do it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And they blew the socks off my feet. They were fantastic. And I, again, don't have the accelerated kids. I have general and CT. And I was, after reading some of the IEPs of some of my students, I was like, oh man, they're really going to struggle. And actually those kids did better on it. My kids who normally get accommodations or think a little bit more abstractly that need accommodations were the ones who picked up on patterns and recognizing certain things faster than kids who do not. So I think that's really important for people to know, is that the storylines are great. And you'll be pleasantly surprised with how well your kids pick up this.
Yeah, like I said in the last presentation, it feels unnatural. It's going to be a challenge because it's not what you're used to, or how you're used to teaching and presenting information to students. So I just want to keep reiterating that, because I feel like if you start doing it, you're going to think that, oh, I'm not doing it right, or it's not working. But I think getting through the year, you'll see the progress over time with your students.
And I think at this point, you're like, what do you mean the next topics then? You talk about phylogenetic trees, food webs, how energy is used, digestion. So you move on from genetics at this point, and you think like, how could that possibly be useful to them? But just keep in mind that through many of the other storylines, they're going to see genetics lots more time. So this is just a little introduction. They're going to have a little bit of background that they'll take with them into the next storyline. So just keep in mind that like, we're not doing a genetics unit right now. We're going to move on to another topic that is actually essentially seemingly unrelated, but fits within the storyline and gives the students an opportunity to see lots of different topics and how they relate back to that original phenomenon that we watched. So seems a little bit weird. They probably won't remember alleles off the top of their head when you get to the next section, but that repetition does make it really easy for them to grasp the big concepts by the end of the school year. So just kind of trust the process and be patient. And I think it is helpful now that I've already done it for a school year to know like that it's going to come up again, but it's always a little bit unclear, you know, like, will they see this again? Do I need to revisit this right now? Do I need to go into more detail right now in this specific activity? But I can say with confidence now that students see them so often that they start to like, you know, start repeating things before you even say them. So they do pick up on the activities, connections and things like that a lot better when you're doing little topics throughout the way. So genetics will come back. There's plenty of genetics and it's a lot of fun and students really do enjoy the storylines with the other genetics topics in there. But the rest of this unit I think is primarily focused more around energy and food webs and photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you get a nice mix within the storylines. You don't get too bored with one particular topic because they're so interwoven within each other. So.
And I know Laurel just said the awful P word that most students dread is photosynthesis. And you'll be surprised when you get to there without having to go into every single detailed step of everything, just how much more the kids are able to go ahead and understand the importance of photosynthesis and cellular respiration and in that cyclical cycle. Same goes for nutrient cycles. And also when later on, it's at the end of homeostasis into melanin, I believe, when we do mitosis and meiosis, they actually do a really good job without knowing every single step of like prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. They do a really good job of being able to identify what phase a cell is in without actually knowing those steps and to know why they're going through those phases. They do a really great job on it. Trying to think. I found a way to unmute people. So I'm gonna, in a little bit, unmute everyone. So that way, if you're like, I have a question, but I really don't want to type it in, because believe me, I'm that person usually, you can just go ahead and ask it. But I'll ask if Laurel or Jessica have anything else that they want to go ahead and add.
Got nothing else. So yeah, we would have obviously gone into a little bit more detail if we were in person here doing this activity. So, you know, feel free to go through some activities throughout the year at all if you are doing them. And you can send us an email like 6 months from now about one specific activity if you feel the need to do that. So don't be afraid to reach out.
All right, I'm gonna unmute you all real quick. I found that feature. I don't know if it's gonna work, but I found it. So I should be able. Yes. I can't get your cameras because it has to do with bandwidth. But if you do have a question, please let us know. Mute, unmute, unmute. Okay, I think everyone's unmuted. So if you have a question, please let us know. Please shout it out. I have my folders in front of me. So if there's something you're like, oh, I want to see how that's done, I can show it to you real quick if I have it readily, if I can find it. But
Otherwise, Alice, you did take your attendance.
I did take my attendance.
So if you have no questions, you are free to go, I think.
Yeah.
Through all of our essential information.
There is one activity that's in elephants. It's the second half where it is elephant poop. So you do have to make elephant poop at some point as a heads up. The kids love it. They think it's great. You grow some plants for a while, but I just came across that data. But yeah, attendance has been taken. If you don't have any questions, feel free to go ahead and sign off. Please email us if you have any questions. Or if you just want to throw it in the chat real quick, you can.
Bonnie has a question about how their EOC scores compared to others. So
I don't know if we're allowed to share that.
I know that in general, like Dr. Crean, the guy who is in charge of creating this curriculum, talks about test scores specifically, that they are typically improved, but they don't have an EOC in Illinois the same way that we do here. So I think our EOC scores are coming out shortly. I know that it's been talked about throughout the state. So I'm hoping we can see those numbers soon and be able to use those. We started it 2 years ago and didn't have an EOC. So last year's data will be the first time we'll be able to fully explore those a little bit better. But I know that Dr. Crean does talk about it in some of his presentations and things like that. So he should be able to, I assume he has specific data, but I'm not sure how that relates to our EOC here.
I was going to say, I know Anne has the data and she's going through and analyzing it and sorting it and should be pushing that out to us shortly. So all three of us are here at South High. So we'll let you make your own opinions when they push out everyone's score. And I'm sure, I know we're all, everyone here at our site did storylines last year, unless it was virtual. I got switched to teaching a virtual bio halfway through the year when we were consolidating and all that sort of stuff. And it was just easier for me to do a traditional bio. So I picked up with genetics and then went to evolution and then went to ecology. It was just easier in terms of with the asynchronous and the kids being on campus and all of that craziness when they were strictly virtual to do a traditional storyline, but everyone who was seated in person at South last year did storylines, if that helps.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can, Bonnie.
Okay, I was talking and I wasn't knowing if you could hear me. So you guys said that you have, like, everyone at South used storylines, so you didn't compare like someone who wasn't using it with someone who was?
That was our original plan 2 years ago, that we were going to have, we had half of our department doing storylines and half doing traditional. And then with COVID, we weren't able to really compare those directly. And then last year, everyone jumped in head first. So all of the biology teachers at South last year did storylines. So
I'm just curious to see how the kids truly compare, you know?
definitely. I mean, yeah, we are very curious as well, because in the moment, it's really hard to tell if it's, you know, if you're feeling successful. It is uncomfortable most days because it's such a different style. So hopefully the test scores will just, you know, validate all the effort that we've been going through the last 2 years. So.
Okay.
In years past, I know kids have said with the EOC, oh, that was hard. Oh, I don't remember that. Oh, you know, this, that, or the other. But this year when they came out of it, they're like, that was really easy. And so I want to see their questions that they had, because I think that's one of the frustrating things about the EOC, and I understand why they do it. But it's like, I want to know what those questions were. Did you know that? Did you really not know that? But majority of our kids, I feel, are like, oh, that was really easy. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm really hoping it was. But we'll see when we get those scores.
I know, like, the students at East said the same thing when they got out of the EOC, was like, that was easy. So
yeah,
I'm just kind of curious to see.
I think we're all in the same boat. We all want to know.
I miss the old days where we'd actually get the scores back before the end of the school year. So you had like you could really assess, how did I do this year? And it's hard to do when you're not going to get it to October and you're like, well, that year's done. And I've already, like, halfway through the semester.
Started, yeah. I think one of the really helpful documents is that MLS alignment that Dr. Crean put together. We were hoping that we had kind of a makeshift version of it, but it wasn't nearly as nice as that. And so I think that will really help anyone if they are hesitant and don't want to start with storylines. It is possible for you to pick it up at the semester. Just make sure you do the units that do the standards that you haven't covered yet, if that makes sense. So you could, I mean, if that is the case and we don't actually get anything and you don't want to change up your plan, you could definitely change it at semester. That's always a possibility.
I don't really have any more questions. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was gonna say, Lauren, I see that you're on there. I don't know if you have any questions. Sam and Corinne are here with us, so they did it all. But Lauren, if you have any questions, let us know. We're here. I know you have Taylor. Taylor's great at doing that sort of stuff, but. All right, should we wrap it up then? Well, thank you. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you,
If you
guys.
have any questions, let us know. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording and go from there. Right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.